So my name's Liang. I'm 35 years old, and I'm actually a family physician and a sports medicine physician, and I live in Burlington. One fun fact about me is I play trumpet and piano. I guess the story starts with my grandparents. My grandparents were all from villages in southern China, so small villages. My grandfathers moved to Tanzania for work. They had two different jobs. One worked for Shell, I believe, and one was a farmer. And then they sent back to China for mail order brides from those villages. So that's how my grandmothers ended up moving to these remote villages in Tanzania, having to learn Swahili, having to adjust to a whole new culture. And there was a small community of Chinese people who kind of grew up together in Tanzania. So my parents were in Tanga and Dar es Salaam. And essentially how my parents sort of moved out of there was Tanzania gained independence from the UK, and my parents were sort of offered the opportunity to go to the UK. So they went to the United Kingdom. They lived there for quite a few years, and then they had me. So I was actually born in London, England, and my parents decided to try to enter a lottery to come to Canada, because at the time my grandmother was here. I believe one or two of my dad's brothers were here, so they wanted to see what life was like here, and they just decided to enter this lottery that the United Kingdom was holding to have the opportunity to come here. So they actually came in November of 1989, and they originally didn't like it, so they found it was very cold, and they didn't feel like it was a good fit. So they actually went back to England for a month and then realized they actually liked it more in Canada. And I think the main reasons why they liked it more was because economically it made more sense. They were getting, a little bit more living space for the amount that they were making. They also just loved being outdoors. I think the opportunity to live in a country that was just, less busy than the UK, a little bit more space, a little less densely populated, just having a little bit more freedom that way, I think really appealed to them. And it was similar to how they grew up, just having more outdoor space and not living in such a crowded city. So I think those were the main reasons why they decided to come here, as well as obviously having family here as well. Yeah, so I ended up being in Burlington because my husband at the time was working in Toronto, and when we moved to Burlington, I was working in Hamilton, so it just seemed like a nice in-between place to be. We had also lived here for a year before we officially moved here, and we really liked the community. We liked the fact that we could, do lots of outdoor things, go hiking. We had, Toronto fairly close by, Hamilton fairly close by, and we had family in both of those places, so it was kind of like a convenient place to be. But we tried moving here just to see what things would be like when it was kind of a central place for us in terms of commuting. And we loved it so much that we ended up buying a house here and actually settling here for, again, lots of reasons. The outdoor spaces, being able to go hiking, convenience in terms of transit, all of those sorts of things. And I think the Burlington community has a lot to offer young families, lots of opportunities for kids to be able to play with other children. We have the early on programs, community centers, just some opportunities that wouldn't really be available in some of the smaller cities that we were looking at. So I think for my parents, the difficult things were obviously leaving when they initially left Tanzania to go to the UK. Like my mother literally had $100 and her suitcase of clothes. Like it was very much that immigrant story of just trying to find your place, start working, start earning money. Coming to Canada, I think was the biggest challenge was probably, again, adjusting to living in the countryside. So my parents were living in London, England, like a very, very busy city. And coming to Canada, they had to adjust to living, in the suburbs. And then my parents moved very quickly from the suburbs to a farm. So, having to adjust to that drastic change, I think, in culture was difficult. I think the weather was also difficult, like having grown up in a fairly mild climate, moving to the UK was colder, moving to Canada was even colder. So I think adjusting to, the weather, driving conditions, all of those things, I think was difficult for them as well. But I do think that having, some family here really helped them. I think making those community connections, because they were kind of forced to talk to other parents at the school. They already knew how to speak English, so that wasn't a major barrier for them. I think that made things a lot easier. And then obviously, as I got involved in more activities, they kind of met other people and started to form connections in the community, even though they were living in a farm area, like a rural area. That's sort of how they started making connections. Well, the first year we came here, there was quite a lot of snow. So our first Christmas was like a white Christmas, which was kind of nice. So I think my parents kind of struggling to deal with that and manage that was a challenge for sure. I think that was the biggest thing from their first winter here. Yeah, and in terms of me moving to Burlington specifically, I think the biggest surprise, I guess it wasn't a challenge for me, but the biggest surprise has just been, I think, how much has been available in the community. Again, having grown up in Flamborough, I didn't have as many opportunities. Like, we don't have like several community centers. We didn't have any of those things, especially at the time when I grew up, Waterdown really wasn't developed. So there really wasn't anything nearby. So it's nice for me to, be able to take my kids to community centers, to these different places, because I grew up at a time and a place where there wasn't those opportunities. So I think that's been the biggest surprise for me moving to Burlington, was really getting that sense of community. I think for my parents, the biggest challenge was transportation. For them, in London, it was very easy to get places. You could walk places, you can take public transit. But when they moved out to Flamborough, that really wasn't an opportunity that they had. So they had to sort of drive everywhere, which they weren't really used to. I think that's probably something that they miss, and they probably still miss it, because even though Waterdown has developed quite a lot, they still are at least a 10-minute drive from everything, whereas it's just not a very walkable community. And I think that was the biggest challenge for them, was kind of leaving all that behind. I think they really did miss, that circle of friends that they had, and they kind of grew up together. They struggled together when they all immigrated to the UK, because they all came from those communities in Tanzania. So I think they kind of miss that, and to this day, they always reconnect and talk about kind of their lives now. But I think that was a big adjustment for them for sure, because they kind of left that community that they grew up with and had struggled with, I should say, for all those years. And that's your formative time, right? Like when you're in your early 20s. So I think that was the biggest challenge for sure, was leaving that behind, and I think that's the biggest thing that they missed. So it's still a functioning farm. My dad doesn't farm it anymore. He rented the land to other farmers, so he still lives on the farm, but he doesn't actively farm anymore. Yeah, so my dad actually bought the farm a bit on a whim. So my dad actually was a carpenter. When he was in the UK, and then when he came here, he was kind of just looking to farm, because he kind of knew a little bit about farming. Like, his father was a farmer. So he was actually going to farm, Canadian crops, but then the person that he connected to was actually selling a Chinese vegetable farm. So my dad was like, oh, this is a great opportunity for me, because I already know Cantonese and Mandarin. He had spent some of his high school years in Beijing, so he actually did some schooling in Beijing. So because he knew the language, that's why he decided to take over that particular farm. But it was definitely a bit of an adjustment for sure, because that's not really what he intended to do. He intended to just farm, and then he sort of had to adjust to taking over an existing farm with existing clientele, and so that was. It's different, I guess, than starting from scratch, right? Because you're trying to fill someone else's shoes. I think my dad had, there's always these like courses and certificates that you can kind of get to learn about the different pesticides and different things that you use. But obviously, in theory, it's always different than in practice. So actually doing those things and adjusting to seasonal climate changes and all those kinds of things throughout the season, right? So oftentimes things happen where you lose a whole field of crops, or the refrigerator's not working properly and you lose a lot of crops. So I think a lot of those kinds of challenges can happen, like unforeseen challenges, which you might not expect. Like you might feel like it's a very straightforward path. I think my dad did have to his advantage the fact that he did have those that language ability. Like he was multilingual, so he was able to kind of make those connections a little bit easier. But at the same time, he still had to go out there and meet all these new people and sort of establish new relationships with them from somebody who had relationships with them for years and years, right? So always, trying to fill someone else's shoes is, I think, a big challenge. So he was pretty happy doing it though. Like I think he enjoyed doing it. I think if he'd had the opportunity to have more education when he was younger, he probably wouldn't have chosen to do that kind of job. But I think he made a good living out of it, and he was successful in doing it. I feel like the most helpful people for my parents were probably my grandmother and my uncles who were here at the time. I think they sort of, gave them that sense of like home and community when they didn't really have that established yet. So knowing people here, I think, was definitely their biggest support. And obviously, I was very young at the time. Like I was only a year and a half when we moved here, right? So having my grandmother around to kind of help with some childcare while my parents were kind of establishing their careers, I think was super helpful for them. So I think my parents have been really resilient through their whole lives. Like obviously they had to adjust to multiple different transitions. I actually think they found strength within themselves, like their own resiliency, being able to kind of say like, if you work hard, you'll be able to succeed, because they've kind of experienced that in their transitions over time. So I think that's kind of been their biggest source of strength. Obviously being able to rely on each other, but obviously just being confident in themselves and knowing that they had the ability to work hard and be persistent, and that things would probably turn out for the best if they kind of just kept trying. I think that's the belief in themselves that was the really driving factor to kind of get them through those difficult times. I think my parents have friends of all different ages, of all different cultures, and I kind of have a similar friendship group. And I look at some people from my parents' generation, and they only have friends of one culture or one age group or one hobby. And I think that, them being able to be open-minded, them having all these unique experiences has really given them a very rich life in terms of the activities that they're involved in, the community that surrounds them. I think that kind of brings, a more unique life experience, having friends from different backgrounds and different ages, and I think that's been the biggest advantage, I guess, for my parents, having had such a unique life, and also having passed that advantage to me, being able to talk to people from different backgrounds, hold conversation with different people, make friendships, make connections, always being able to find a way to connect with people from different backgrounds. It's really helped me, obviously, in my career in medicine, like being able to connect with people from different ethnicities and cultures and ages and life experiences. I think that's the biggest lesson that their journey has taught me, and their struggles have reflected for me. So a couple of big things. So in our culture, we exchange hongbao, like laisi, when you get together for family events like birthdays or, like introducing a new baby to the family, like these kinds of events. So we still follow a lot of those Chinese traditions of giving money in red packets, that sort of tradition. We all do speak Cantonese still, so we have maintained some language connections for sure. One of the things I think that my husband was quite surprised at is that we still visit my grandfather at the cemetery, and we perform like a traditional ceremony for him to celebrate his life, and it's kind of like a tribute to your ancestors. So in Chinese it's called Bai San. So you're basically like praying to your ancestors or like wishing them well. He was really surprised at that because he's from Hong Kong and they didn't really do that. So I think that's something that's quite unique to my parents having grown up in those small villages. So that's a tradition that we've continued to this day. And I think that's kind of a really meaningful tradition that I'd like to continue with my kids as well. So for my family, so I have 3 kids, we try and do some, family traditions now that they're a little bit older. So one tradition that we started a couple years ago was going to the Maple Syrup Festival, so a very uniquely Canadian experience. So usually we'll go to Crawford Lake or Kelso, and the kids really enjoy it, and we kind of learn about the history of how they make maple syrup, and they just like to eat maple syrup candy. I guess when my parents were growing up in Tanzania, like my mom always talks about the fact that they, would always help each other out. Like they had like a very open community. So if somebody needed something, somebody needed somebody to watch their kids, I think they were just kind of all interconnected. And I think the pandemic kind of mess things up a little bit in terms of developing that in some of our communities in Canada. But I think that's the direction in which a lot of communities are going. So I've seen, even in my neighborhood, like people having like annual Christmas parties now. We kind of started doing kind of more neighborhood traditions, garage sales, those kinds of things. And so I think as you get to know your neighbors and feel more comfortable, that openness, is something that is similar. Obviously, it's just human nature to try and help somebody else. So I think that's kind of the biggest similarity that I think we can probably replicate now that we're kind of emerging from the pandemic. And yeah, it is a little bit surprising because I think culturally, Canadians and North Americans tend to be more individualistic. Like we try and stick to ourselves, we try and stay in our own individual family homes. But as we kind of come out of the pandemic, we kind of learned that we have to sort of rely on each other. And I think building that sense of community through all of these community events, neighborhood parties, all of those things, I think that sense of community is something that, will hopefully emerge again and be a similarity across different countries for sure. So these are super, super old pictures. So this is my grandparents getting married in Africa, super old pictures. So this is my mom's dad and my mom's mom. So as I mentioned before, both of my grandmothers were kind of mail order brides or arranged marriages. So they kind of really didn't know what they were getting into. Yeah. And then this is a picture here of my mom as a baby. So again, not a ton of pictures, obviously, at the time, but there's a little picture of her as a baby. I'm just going back to see if there's another one here. This is my parents when they first moved to the UK. So I have a bunch of pictures here, but these are the pictures from my parents when they first moved to the UK. So this is them with their friend group, all growing up together in their 20s, going to the beach. So there's a couple pictures there. And then I will just jump ahead to some of the more recent pictures, because these ones I had to kind of dig through. So these are pictures of our first experiences in Canada. So my parents came for a visit a couple of times. So this is me when I was around 9 months or so. So they came for a couple of visits. There were some pictures of them. This is still also back in the UK, so there's a couple pictures there. And then there is a picture here I wanted to show, which is my first Christmas here. This is the house that I grew up in England. And then there's a picture here. Find it. It's this one. So this is the first Christmas here. So in this picture, we had just moved here. We've been here for about a month, and so that's my first Christmas in Canada. So I was about a year and a half old. And that's I think our first snowstorm here. So that's me in front of like my grandmother's house in a snowsuit, which I never would have needed, I guess, in London. Yeah, sure. So as I said, like I grew up in a pretty rural area. I mean, you could see the houses around us, but it wasn't really a walkable neighborhood. So I think one of the biggest ways that we got involved when I was really young was that I joined Brownies and Girl Guides. And so it was at like one of the local churches and kind of brought people in from all over the community. Because again, we couldn't really like walk to one place. So all of us kind of drove there. It kind of gave us that sense of, purpose, because we were going on like camping trips together. We were like earning badges, you were doing activities together as like a group. And so a couple of the girls that I did Girl Guides with, I'm actually still friends with to this day. So that's kind of nice to still maintain that connection with them. But for my mom, she joined as a Girl Guide leader, and that really helped her again to get to know her community, get to know the local resources and what was available to her, because we would take trips to Valens Conservation Area. We would do community events at seniors' homes, so kind of let her kind of learn the neighborhood a little bit more and the surrounding neighborhoods, and also helped her meet other parents who had kids a similar age to me. So that was nice for her too. So now the biggest community thing that my husband and I are both involved in is music. So we both are part of the Burlington Concert Band. We actually met through music. My husband and I have been playing instruments for quite a long time. So we met while we were both in university. We both were playing in musical ensembles at McMaster, and so we just continued to do that as we've grown together as a couple. And I think it's a really nice event for us to be able to, a really nice activity for us to do together once a week, which is really nice. And it also allows us to give back to the community. So that concert band provides music for the community, but they're primarily a nonprofit organization to raise money for different charities. So I think that's kind of been a nice way for us to volunteer. We've both been on the executive and helping organize concerts and making connections with the community, getting to know people in the Burlington community in that band. Like a lot of our closest friends we met through that band as well. And talking to, again, people of different backgrounds, of different musical backgrounds, but of different cultural backgrounds as well. And we all learn from each other, whether it's through music or through our life experiences. I think it's a really nice community to be a part of. So I really am appreciative of that. And I think that kind of, again, stems from the fact that my mother was determined to get me involved in community events, right? So whether it was joining Girl Guides at the same church we did Girl Guides, we also joined a children's choir, and it was a choir, eventually became an adult choir that my mom was able to be a part of as well. So I think, establishing in me at a young age that sense of community, like taking me out to events, making that extra effort to take me to all these extracurricular activities, I think really showed me the value of joining those community activities when I was older. So to be honest, I haven't found anything that's been that helpful in Burlington to connect me to other people from a similar background. I suppose I would identify as being, a foreign-born Chinese person. So we would love to have more friends who, speak Cantonese or do the same kinds of, traditions as, our families have growing up. But in Burlington, there just are not a lot of Cantonese Chinese people. Most of the people who live in Burlington are Mandarin speaking from mainland China. So I haven't really actually found any great organizations that have connected me with my community. I think there have been, definitely a lot of Chinese cultural events in recent years. They've had, I believe the last 2 or 3 years, they've had Lunar New Year events. But again, not necessarily directed towards, the Cantonese population. My husband, growing up in Mississauga, he had, much more opportunity to connect with his culture when he was growing up, because there were just a lot more Hong Kong Chinese people that were living in his area. His parents, mostly had Hong Kong Chinese people around them. They were kind of, I guess, what I was alluding to, that generation of people who only connects with their own, people of their own background. So he had a lot of that growing up, and it would be nice to kind of reconnect to that. But I think it's difficult in Burlington for sure. We just don't have a big community of Cantonese speaking immigrants. I think it would be nice for a couple of reasons. Like, I think it would be nice for my children to learn a little bit of Cantonese. We try to speak to them in Cantonese at home, but it's different than obviously being able to take them to events. When I was growing up, I was actually in a Cantonese Chinese school every Saturday morning in Hamilton, but that actually has really diminished. Like, there's only, I think, one Cantonese school now, and that is that same one in Hamilton. So the opportunities, I think, are very limited for us to continue to maintain our language and try and pass that on to our children. So I think trying to have them learn it at home is probably the easiest way. I don't think it's going to be that easy for them to learn it in the community. Or I was telling my husband, maybe we have to take them, to Hong Kong like every other summer and suffer through the heat together to try to get them to learn a little bit more of the language. But it is definitely difficult to maintain the culture and the language. One good thing though about, being in this generation is that we do have so many opportunities to find resources on the internet. So I know a lot of my friends who are trying to teach their children specific languages, they find children's shows that are only in that particular language, right? And it's like, oh, you only get to watch this show if it's in, French or in Cantonese or in Mandarin. So I think there are a lot of resources online. I just think it's not the same as learning it through a community, right? Like, it's just not the same thing. And obviously we try not to give our kids too much television. We're trying to restrict the screen time already. So face-to-face is obviously always better. As they get older, I'd like to take them to more of those cultural events for sure, like the Lunar New Year event in Burlington. I'd like to do all of that. When they get older, they kind of can understand a little bit more about what's happening.
Are you aware of it?
I would say Burlington's community is... I find when I'm walking around, there's kind of like a mix of two different communities. There's obviously people who've lived here for a very, very long time. And in my neighborhood, there's people, who moved into that neighborhood as their starter home and have lived there for 40 years. I think there's that generation. And typically, I think Burlington has been seen as being an older population. But I do think over the last 4 to 5 years, there's definitely been a lot of growth. So in the Alton neighborhood, lots of young families of different backgrounds coming in. And even in my neighborhood, on my street, there has been, several new families who have moved in, lots of younger babies being born in the last 3-4 years, which is nice for me and my family, because we can sort of let our kids, have play dates and things with other neighbors. But I think overall, the perception of Burlington is that we still cater towards older populations. I think that's going to be a difficult thing to sort of shift over time. Even looking at Burlington culture and recreation, like a lot of those activities are aimed towards seniors 55 and up, right? So even when I was looking for activities for myself to do or for my kids to do, I do think that as the population shifts to under 30, we kind of have to offer more as a community to those families that are coming in. I would say be open to the opportunities that are presented to you. I think, sometimes people, again, have that ideal situation of what they want life to be like. And I think it's very difficult now with the rising costs of housing and all these things. Like, I think you just kind of have to lower your expectations to some degree and be realistic and be opportunistic about what comes up for you. And as my parents said, like, if you work hard at the opportunities that present themselves to you, you will be able to be successful and hopefully be able to take steps towards your dreams as it comes up. But I think you kind of have to be more realistic and more opportunistic about what's available to you. I think there's a couple of big issues. Obviously, right now, I mean, the housing crisis is one of them, but also I think even finding childcare is really, really difficult. So a lot of my friends who have their first baby are having a really hard time finding childcare, and they've had to be resourceful in using like home daycares or using relatives or friends to kind of help them out. So I think my advice to new immigrants would be just try and take the opportunities as they come, try and use community resources as much as possible, and try and use other people as much as possible. Like ask your community for suggestions, like what home daycares are good, what events can I take my children to, what events can I take my elderly parents to. And I think that really is the best way of connecting with people and being able to survive. Like I do think it takes a village now more than ever, because we have such limited resources, in healthcare, in housing, in childcare, that we do need to rely on others. And those online forums, they can sometimes be a very, dangerous place in terms of scams, or they can sometimes be very negative. But I do think there's a lot of positivity that comes out of them. I do think there's a lot of people who are giving helpful suggestions and recommendations based on their experiences. And it really has helped me as a young parent to take my kids to different things, to know what's available and what's out there. And I would encourage new immigrants to do the same thing, to find those opportunities that would be helpful for them. Yeah, so I think the biggest challenges are that I think in Canada in general, we have a hard time supporting the population with public services. So again, I think the childcare issue is huge. Just not having enough spots for the number of parents who need childcare, who want to go back to work. Healthcare is a major problem, not having enough family physicians who want to do family medicine because of funding issues. I think there's, a lot of challenges in terms of being able to provide enough of those public services at a high enough quality for our growing population. I think that's the biggest challenge for sure. And that's why I think new immigrants, again, kind of have to rely on their communities a little bit more to be able to connect and to be able to find, a healthcare provider, to be able to find childcare, to be able to find housing. I think it's more important than ever that we sort of rely on each other to find those resources, because I think those are the biggest challenges for sure. So I think there are definitely some similarities. I think that, my mother's stereotypical immigrant story of going somewhere with a suitcase and $100 is probably not the traditional story anymore. But I think the similarity of, having a cultural struggle, trying to, adjust to being in a city versus living in a rural area, I think all of those challenges are still there for a lot of immigrants. I mean, most immigrants who come here, a lot of them, I should say, are coming from very developed cities overseas, and then to come here, trying to navigate, learning to drive potentially, all of those sorts of things. I think those are, struggles that everyone kind of shares. Whether it was my parents' story or now, I think the struggle to, find a job, find connections in the community, sort of orient yourself to what's available in the community. I think that challenge is also similar, and probably easier now because of the internet, I would hope, and also all the resources, that the library provides, that different organizations provide. I think it is probably easier now than it used to be, but I do think that's still a struggle for sure. Anything else? I think it was pretty good opportunity to talk about some of the challenges in the community and share a little bit of my family story. I think it was nice because obviously before my grandparents, I think the story kind of gets lost, and so being able to kind of share a little bit of that with my community is nice, and also for my children to kind of know where they came from and know kind of how I felt in the moment when they were young. My perspective probably will change by the time they're old enough to understand sort of the situation as well, and in terms of where they came from. So I think that's really nice for them. So thanks for the opportunity.